The images have been ingrained in our consciousness. The great Jackie Robinson swinging the bat, tearing up the base paths as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, making history by breaking the Major League color line in 1947. But before his debut at Brooklyn's Ebbets Field, Jackie spent a season north of the border, playing for the Dodgers' top farm club, the Montreal Royals. While enduring intense racial hatred elsewhere, Montreal provided a kind of oasis, an environment of acceptance.
When I broke in with the Montreal Ball Club, I knew that it was going to be difficult, but I had a lot of people rooting for me. Day in and day out, I received letters and people telling me that their prayers were with me and wishing me well. And fortunately, I broke in a city like Montreal. We have a tremendously warm spot for that city.
Montreal versus in the United States. Was there a big difference?
Oh, tremendous difference, tremendous difference.
Montreal was a perfect launching place for Jack's career.
They treated us so well. All they asked us was we went out and played baseball as best as we possibly could. And naturally, being a ball player, that's all that I wanted a fan to do.
It's been 70 years since he played baseball for the Montreal Royals. 6 months living and working here, his impact still resonates today throughout the city of Montreal.
He was really a superstar here. It was also a place where he could come back from playing in the States, getting booed, getting cried at, and come back and have people adore him. And I think that made a big, big difference for him as a person.
This was an integral part of the development of the Jackie Robinson story.
What a statement to say he'd never had a happier year than his year in Montreal. That says everything right there.
We won the Little World Series that year. Jack was very instrumental in that happening.
It was probably the only day in history, wrote Sam Moulton, that a black man ran from a white mob with love instead of lynching on its mind.
And it's just a sort of incredible point of pride with Canadians, with Montrealers to this day. The Jackie Robinson experiment probably would not have worked had it not been for having that experience in a nearly 99% white city.
Montreal for us, it was fabulous.
The love that we took from Montreal really sustained us. And so coming home to Montreal, to me, is coming back to really the birthplace of my belief in brotherhood. I really believe it can happen.
Jack Roosevelt Robinson was born the youngest of 5 children near the small town of Cairo, Georgia, on January 31st, 1919. In post-Reconstruction America, black families lived under Jim Crow segregation, facing a constant threat of violence. The year Robinson was born, at least 21 African Americans were lynched in Georgia alone.
My grandmother, who was a very strong woman, knew that she could not raise her 4 boys and 1 girl in the Deep South.
She had a brother who had moved to Los Angeles, so she had a place to go.
Determined to escape the prison of Jim Crow, Mally and her family settled with her half-brother in Pasadena, where Mally believed there would be more opportunity. But Pasadena had its own version of Jim Crow. The municipal pool was for whites only, until protests by African-American activists inspired International Day. On Tuesdays, Black, Asian, and Mexican residents were allowed to swim, but city officials promised whites that the pool would be drained and cleaned before reopening. 2 of Mally's sons had begun to excel at sports. His older brother, Mac, earned a place on the 1936 U.S. Olympic track and field team that competed in Berlin.
This is an athlete who had won a medal under the eye of Adolf Hitler. He came back to Pasadena, and Mac Robinson could only find work as a garbage man. That's something that Jackie Robinson never forget.
He would wear his Olympic jacket while he cleaned the streets.
Jack's talents on the baseball diamond so impressed his classmates that they offered to share their lunches with him if he chose to play on their team. In 1937, Jack Robinson enrolled at Pasadena Junior College. He was outstanding in every sport he played and began to make a name for himself in the Los Angeles area.
He was a local tennis champion. He was a local football star. He was a great track star. Baseball was really almost the last thing. He was great at everything. He could have done anything.
By the end of his first full year, he had lettered in 4 varsity sports.
You could make an argument that Jackie Robinson was the greatest athlete in American history. Jackie Robinson could have been a star in every single one of those sports.
In the fall of 1940, he met a 17-year-old nursing student from Los Angeles named Rachel Isom.
First of all, he was big man on campus and very attractive in that respect. I felt he adored me. I cherished that. He didn't just respect me, he needed me.
The Second World War had put in stark relief the discrimination that African Americans continued to face. Black soldiers returned from fighting for freedom overseas, only to find they were still being denied freedom and opportunity at home. And because African Americans were barred from playing in the major leagues of America's national pastime, they formed their own separate but athletically equal leagues and teams. In late March 1945, Jackie Robinson reported to the Kansas City Monarchs spring training camp in Houston, where he made the team as shortstop. Jackie hated life in the Negro Leagues.
The teams were poorly financed. Travel schedules were unbelievably hectic. Some of the crummy eating joints would not serve us at all.
Baseball was a white man's game for a century. The very first game of organized baseball was played in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1846. For exactly 100 years, all the players in the major leagues and the many minor leagues were white.
The commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, an implacable foe of integration, claimed that the subject of Negro ball players had never come up. In 1942, the Dodgers hired Branch Rickey as president and general manager. He would set in motion events that would have a profound effect on the history of the United States. For years, Rickey had been haunted by the discrimination he had witnessed in his country and in its national game. Now, he resolved to do something about it.
Everybody in baseball is going to be against me, but I'm going to do it.
Rickey immediately instructed his scouts to begin searching for the right man.
Jack Roosevelt Robinson, four-sport college man out of UCLA. That means he's played with white boys. Kansas City Monarchs, 26 years old. He's batting 350.
Branch Rickey called his scout, Clyde Sukeforth.
Well, he called me and he said, I want you to see a game in Chicago Friday night, the Kansas City Monarchs. He said, pay in particular attention to a fellow named Robinson.
After the game, Sukeforth introduced himself to Robinson and explained that he had come on behalf of Branch Rickey.
Mr. Rickey, what's this about?
When he first met Jack, he said, do you have a woman? And Jack said, yes. He said, well, you'll need her. He sort of predicted that, I think was part of his plan.
Rickey encouraged Robinson to marry Rachel. Then, after a flurry of other personal questions, turned the conversation to baseball.
This is about baseball, Jackie. I see you starting in spring with our affiliate in Montreal. If you make it there, try it down here.
Me? Play for Montreal?
I want to win pennants, and we need ball players.
Montreal was specifically chosen by Dodgers owner Branch Rickey as a place where Jackie could be comfortable and could concentrate on the challenges ahead of him.
They seem to believe in the Dodgers organization that cities that had important French-speaking populations would be more welcoming of black players.
There's one condition. Can you control your temper?
My temper?
He said, what I need is more than a great player. I need a man that'll take abuse, insults, in other words, carry the flag for the race.
A black man in white baseball. Can you imagine the reaction?
You want a player who doesn't have the guts to fight back?
I want a player who's got the guts not to fight back.
He was everything that I had hoped he would be at that moment. The surprise of that whole occasion was Robinson. I couldn't convince him that I was giving him this interview and considering him for a job on the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Then they said, Mr. Rickey, if you want to take this gamble, I'll promise you there'll be no incident. And that was just what Rickey wanted to hear.
Meanwhile, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who had done more than any other to perpetuate baseball's color line, had died. Branch Rickey saw an opening and began to accelerate his plans. He immediately ordered Robinson to attend a press conference in Montreal. Hector Racine, president of the Royals, introduced Jackie Robinson to stunned Montreal reporters. "We are signing this boy," he told the writers, "because we think it a matter of fairness." Robinson impressed everyone with his intelligence and self-assurance, and while he acknowledged concern over how players and fans would respond, he insisted he was ready to take the chance. "Maybe I'm doing something for my race," he told them. In the white press, Daily News columnist Jimmy Powers, doubting that Robinson had the skills to make the majors, pronounced him a 1,000-to-1 shot. On February 10, 1946, Jackie and Rachel were married at the Independent Church of Christ in Los Angeles.
We never really had a honeymoon. We went to our first spring training on our honeymoon. It was terrible.
For the first week of spring training, the Montreal team would practice in Sanford, Florida. The press barraged Jackie with questions. "Do you think you can get along with these white boys?" one reporter asked.
"You after Pee Wee Reese's job?"
Reese plays for Brooklyn. Still trying to make Montreal.
On March 17th, Montreal played its first official exhibition game against the Dodgers. More than 1,000 black fans turned out to root for Jackie and were confined to the segregated section.
When I met Jackie Robinson, it was in spring training of 1946 after I spent a full year playing for the Montreal Royals. I had married a Montreal girl, and he used to ask me the questions about how he would be taken in Montreal as a black person. That particular year in 1945, we had 2 black Alouette football players playing for us, and they were loved by the public. I had told him that he wouldn't have a problem at all.
Compare your experience in Montreal versus in the United States pertaining to race and how you were accepted or not accepted. Was there a big difference?
Oh, tremendous difference, tremendous difference.
When the Royals went on the road, teams in Jacksonville, Savannah, and Richmond refused to play against Robinson.
In Jacksonville, the game was called off because Jack was there. They locked the park and wouldn't allow the team on the grounds. In Vero Beach, they allowed black people into the stands, but they had a hole in the fence. They couldn't come through the turnstile, and they had to stoop and come in through this hole in the fence. It was so humiliating and so distasteful that I used to go to the park and sit in the car, and I wouldn't go in. I'd listen, try to hear the game on the radio.
In DeLand, Florida, the city canceled the game, claiming the lights didn't work. It was a day game. A game against the St. Paul Saints began without incident. But in the 3rd inning...
In Sanford, Florida, Jack was on the field, and they sent the police out on the field to escort him in. They said they didn't allow mixed games.
Get off the field, now. No niggas gonna play with white boys. Now you get off the field, or go to jail.
So all through Florida, we had that experience.
All spring, Jackie struggled at the plate. One white reporter openly questioned whether he'd still be at training camp if he were white.
We were immersed in a situation in the South that we had never been challenged to that extent and physically threatened. So we were glad to get out of there.
As Robinson settled in at spring training, his hitting improved, and he soon won a spot playing second base for the Montreal Royals.
Jackie, it is my pleasure to tell you that you have earned a place with the Montreal Royals. When they head north, you'll be on the train.
I won't let you down.
I know you won't.
The team traveled north, where they would open their season against the Jersey City Giants. On April 18th, 1946, the capacity crowd at Roosevelt Stadium included thousands of black fans eager to see Jackie play. In his second at-bat with 2 runners on base, he hit a home run into the left field stands.
There's a classic picture. It's a picture that resonated from sea to shining sea. It was his first game ever as a minor league player for the Montreal Royals in the opening day game. So he's the first black minor league player. He hits a home run. as he crosses home plate, a white player actually reaches out and shook the black man's hand. It was a monumental moment.
Right.
It's hard to believe, but it sort of shows you how far we've come.
Correct.
But that was a breakthrough moment for this country.
Right.
It ran on the front pages from New York to Los Angeles.
Skip, I've never seen that picture before.
It's a great one.
It is.
Robinson finished the day 4 for 5, with 2 stolen bases and 4 runs scored. Montreal won 14-1. The New York Times referred to it as a brilliant personal triumph. 2 weeks later, the Robinsons reached Montreal.
Taking all this baggage with me up to Montreal,
my first experience was trying to find a place to live. And in the States, that's where discrimination hits you straight in the face. People don't want to rent to you. So I knocked on a door, and I expected to be rejected. The woman came to the door, and she smiled at me, and she said, "Come in," and she showed me around the apartment.
And I knew the signs when someone's going to turn you off and someone's going to reject you. She wouldn't have shown me around if she didn't intend to let me think about it. I loved the apartment. It was beautifully organized and very nicely kept in a nice neighborhood. It had a nice back porch and a lot of features that I liked.
And then she made tea and had me sit for tea. And then she said, "I want you to be sure to use my linens and my china, and I want you to be here."
And that day we signed the lease.
That introduction just set up Montreal for us. It was fabulous.
Jackie and his new wife Rachel lived here, on a cheery residential street in this multicultural mecca, far from the Jim Crow South where he had suffered through a tumultuous spring training.
This little neighborhood, DeGaspe Street, I was pregnant with Jackie Jr. after we moved there. There was a tendency on the block for people to come out on their back porches in the evening, so you'd wave to people down next door, down this way and that. When the women saw that I was pregnant, they came in to tell me that they wanted to help. Now there was rationing, food stamps. So they would come in and bring me extra stamps so I should get, the proper nutrition. They knew I was sewing my clothes, and they came in to put the hems in my dresses. Oh my goodness. If I'd come walking down the street with my groceries, the kids would come run and help me carry them into the house. Things I wasn't accustomed to anywhere. And even in Los Angeles. Welcome, you're one of us. And they spoke French and I didn't speak French. So we couldn't even communicate that way. It was mostly nodding and smiling and doing. That kept us going.
She did mention that the neighbors, they were very, very protective of her. They would have supper prepared, that when Jackie came home, he would not have the problems, you could relax and unwind. So I think it was more that a little cocoon was built around him and her at that time.
Back in 1946, Montrealers had caught baseball fever. They hadn't yet seen the team which was making history. They eagerly sought tickets for the Royals home opener. After that first incredible game in Jersey City and 2 weeks on the road in the U.S., Jackie Robinson and the Royals finally were home.
We had that same kind of reception in the ballpark when Jack got out on the field. Big excitement. None of the hate notes we had been getting in other situations. He didn't need special guards.
They had over 16,000 people at Delormier Stadium that day, the largest opening day crowd ever. Mayor Camillien Houd threw out the first ball, and Jackie Robinson went on to have a magnificent season.
Montreal fans welcomed Robinson, but on the road, opposing fans and players were less kind. Pitchers aimed at his head. Base runners tried to spike him with their cleats. Crowds rained down abuse. In Baltimore, Rachel sat in front of an angry white fan who screamed about that son of a bitch. In Syracuse, an opposing player threw a black cat onto the field, calling out, "Hey, Jackie, here's your cousin."
And you sat in the stands, and you heard these taunts from fans. And Jackie's on the field, and he hears the taunts from the fans and that crazy manager in the other dugout yelling and screaming.
We had to deal with that only in the ballpark. We had to deal with that in our living arrangements, worry about our accommodations.
I was overestimating my stamina and underestimating the beating I was taking. I couldn't sleep, and often couldn't eat. The doctor was afraid I was going to have a nervous breakdown.
But all that abuse, the threats, the hard times for Jackie took place on the road, not here. This is where the old ballpark was, Delormier Stadium. It's been gone for a long time now, replaced by an athletic field and a school. But this was home for Jackie and the Royals. They loved it here.
All the places where the Royals went to, coming back to Montreal was heaven. It allowed him to come back here to shake off the dirt of racism, the hatred of discrimination, and their French neighbors didn't see him as black, they just saw him as a baseball player.
Jack had to go on the road, and the women noticed that I wasn't coming out on the porch. So they came in to be sure that I was all right and to invite me to their porch, you know, like, because you must be lonely, you know. I mean, they didn't say it in so many words, but that was the feeling that they conveyed to me. So I started to do my part. My porch, there was a French-Canadian family above me with a lot of children. I had a screen door on my porch. So I started putting big bowls of fruit on my kitchen table. So when the kids came down the stairs, they could peek in, and then they would knock, you know. And I decided they must be poor because they had something like 8 kids. And so I would open the door and invite them in and give them fruit and reciprocate in some way. I do believe in reciprocation as part of a relationship.
He wasn't just black, but he was a black American. Color, culture, country. And they embraced him.
In spite of the pressure, Jackie played brilliantly, finishing the season with a league-leading .349 batting average. Montreal won the pennant by 18.5 games, their best season ever. The Royals traveled to Kentucky to face the Louisville Colonels in the Minor Leagues World Series. For the first 3 games, with fans hurling insults, Robinson struggled at the plate. The Colonels took 2 of the first 3. But back in Montreal, Jackie started to hit again. In Game 5, he had a double and a triple and scored twice. He got 2 more hits in Game 6 as the Royals beat the Colonels to win what was called the Little World Series. Ecstatic Montreal fans wouldn't let Robinson leave the stadium.
There's this great story about how after Montreal wins this sort of clinching game, that this sort of white mob of fans storms the field and chases after Jackie Robinson to put him on their shoulders and carry him around Delormier Stadium.
Jack was dressed and came out of the clubhouse, and a mob picked him up on their shoulders and ran down the street singing and celebrating him.
Robinson was almost torn apart by the adoring fans. When he left the ballpark, just about here, there were thousands out on the street, and he literally had to run for his life.
It was probably the only day in history, wrote Sam Moulton in the Pittsburgh Courier, that a black man ran from a white mob with love instead of lynching on its mind.
Well, I'll never forget, after playing in Louisville down in my own country, receiving the kind of boos and the jeers that I did, going back to Montreal, and the warm and the friendly reception that I received there, and the way that they greeted the Louisville players, just to show them that they didn't appreciate at all the reception they gave me in Louisville, is something that you just can't forget. I think the fact that I played in Montreal had a great deal to do with the success that I did have.
Jackie's first season in the minors had been an overwhelming success. They had survived the roller coaster of 1946, but they still didn't know whether Jackie had a future with the Dodgers.
The black papers were saying that if this works, we can integrate the military next. If this works, we can integrate more colleges next. Robinson was a trial balloon, and everybody was watching.
Big League Baseball's owners had gathered for a rare summer meeting to discuss the findings of a special committee. The report offered a litany of arguments justifying the continued exclusion of blacks from the major leagues.
The MacPhail report said that the value of our properties could decline, and that was the veiled way of saying black fans coming into our ballpark will drive white fans away. I mean, the Yankees into the 1950s said bluntly, you know, our Westchester suburban fans don't want to be in the ballpark with black fans.
On April 10th, in the 6th inning of a preseason game between the Royals and the Dodgers, reporters were handed a press release.
Telegram the press. Today, the Brooklyn Dodgers has purchased the contract of Jackie Robinson from the Montreal Royals.
April 15th, 1947 was opening day. The Brooklyn Dodgers faced the Boston Braves at Ebbets Field. Playing first base for the Dodgers was number 42, Jackie Robinson.
If every owners thought that it would hurt attendance, they were dead wrong.
For Robinson's Chicago debut, 46,572 fans had jammed Wrigley Field, while another 20,000 milled about outside, unable to find a ticket. It was the largest paid crowd ever to see a Cubs game at Wrigley. And in Brooklyn, ecstatic fans from across the borough embraced their new hero.
We had arrived. Everybody felt better, breathed deeper, walked taller, stepped with a little bit more glide in their stride and dip in their hip, because Jackie Robinson had come to baseball.
We looked upon Jackie as someone bringing hope that things was going to get better. This was the beginning of a change.
Robinson was selected as the first Rookie of the Year, became the first man in the league in 26 years to steal his way around the bases, and in 1955, he helped the Brooklyn Dodgers win the World Series against the New York Yankees.
Jackie Robinson was now the most famous and admired black man in the country. Voters in a radio poll ranked him second only to Bing Crosby as the most popular American.
After Jackie Robinson left baseball, his fight wasn't over. I mean, he continued to fight for civil rights. He was a member of the NAACP's upper management, campaigned for them, campaigned with Dr. King to try and integrate a lot of America. This was a guy who this meant more to him than just his legacy as a baseball player.
For Jack to have arrived, been able to play, there was a certain sense that there's change possible in America. So it had some real significance, and we're still celebrating it to this very day.
Jack Roosevelt Robinson died at 7:10 a.m. on the morning of October 24th, 1972. He was just 53 years old. The official cause of death was a heart attack.
Jack, as a figure in history, was a rock in the water, creating concentric circles and ripples of new possibility.
Jackie's body was a temple of God, Reverend Jesse Jackson said in his eulogy. In his last dash, Jackie stole home. No grave can hold this body down. It belongs to the ages.
I think the thing I miss the most is having his arms around me. He was very, very expressive. I miss that. I miss that a lot.
I wonder if you could just say for some of the sporting fans in our audience, some of the highlights of your career, the things which stand out in your mind. It's a difficult question, I know.
No, I think the thing that stands out in my mind most of all is the final game of the Little World Series, and then the fans hollering. Finally, they yelled so much we came out and they carried us around the field on their shoulders, and I got a big kick out of it because there had been so much controversy about the possibilities of riots and things when I broke into baseball, and in one short year, the fans in Montreal eliminated all of this by their great warmth and love and the way that they treated us up there. I shall never forget this, as I said before.
Love here in Montreal. The family still loves to come here. They have a plaque on an apartment with these.
My parents had an incredible experience here in Montreal. I loved coming into the neighborhood. It's just sort of surreal almost.
His formative year, and it laid the ground for who he became as an athlete, and his legacy continues 100 years later.
But this discussion was not limited to that 1946 season. Former Montreal Expos star Ellis Valentine found similar acceptance when he arrived here in the 1970s.
Throughout the time that I was here, Bill, I felt that heaven that they spoke about. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. It was pretty rough. When I got with the Expos, and I started to go to places like Jamestown, New York, and Florida, places like that, It was a little bit different.
It's a great city, great people up here. I mean, I spent 3 years here and actually probably 3 of the best years of my career.
The city of Montreal is known for being a trailblazing city. Today is another chapter in that book. In signing Michael Sam, we're signing a trailblazing athlete.
All the questions today finally are about football. How refreshing is that, Michael?
Finally, let's keep it that way.
In the late 70s, early 80s, Kamala Harris spent 5 years at Westmount High.
I think there's a little small maple leaf somewhere.
Her mother, who had experienced both racism and sexism at Berkeley, decided to teach and do research in Canada's McGill University.
I spent many of my teenage years living in Montreal when my mother was teaching at McGill University and doing her research at the Jewish General Hospital. It certainly left me with a lasting impression about how much our two countries have in common.
You know, Montreal also had its own sort of prejudices and anti-Semitism. Certainly, Montreal wasn't perfect. The one person who apparently was tough on Jackie Robinson initially was his manager, who, by the way, was from Mississippi. He was not a Canadian.
You know, you said that you interviewed him.
Yeah,
before.
in fact, he even told me that the best year of his life was his year here. Because Montreal, he never saw intolerance. He never had a bad day in Montreal. And there's a picture, if you go to Dodger Stadium, there's a huge picture of Jackie at the Dodger clubhouse. And the Montreal on his chest, he then was going to become a Dodger.
The contract's worth $36 million, but you can't really put a price really on what they mean, can you?
It's totally priceless. I mean, these are the founding documents of the civil rights movement that started it all. Many historians consider these documents to be the founding documents of the civil rights movement. To have them back where they were signed 70 years ago here in Montreal, making history, and how cool is it that Canada played a huge role in the American civil rights movement? That's something you can never take away. And Larry has a great story about Martin Luther King.
When I interviewed Dr. King, I introduced him by saying, my guest is the founder of the American Civil Rights Movement, and he corrected me and said, no, the founder is Jackie Robinson.
When Dr. King talked about having a dream, well, I like to think that that dream was all about Montreal. And I think that that's what Jackie Robinson found.
It's such a proud accomplishment that we helped him become a Major League Baseball player, the catalyst for change in North America.
We are so honored and proud to be here in Montreal on this hallowed ground, City Hall, to unveil one of the most important moments in the civil rights history, and the world needs to know. Canada led the way, had the courage, as Larry mentioned, welcomed him with open arms.
My favorite quote is that Babe Ruth changed baseball, but Jackie Robinson changed America.
Oh.
And Rachel was right.
I love that.
After he left Montreal after that last game as a Royal, he wrote, "As the plane roared skyward and the lights of Montreal twinkled and winked in the distance, I took one last look at this great city where I had found so much happiness. I don't care if I ever get to the majors, I told myself. This is the city for me. This is paradise." Part of Montreal tradition is a very special lady, Rachel Robinson, Jackie's widow. She's here with us tonight with Howard Cosell. Howard?
Ray, it's so great to see you again. And in this marvelous city, which has such tender memories for you and for your late husband.
It was my first encounter with an atmosphere where there was no discrimination, where we were totally supported warmly, and the love that we took from Montreal really sustained us in the more difficult days when we didn't have that kind of support. And so coming home to Montreal, to me, is coming back to really the birthplace of my belief in brotherhood. I really believe it can happen.
Thank you so much. You've told it all. We're proud to have you here, and that's why so proud we all are to be back at the home of the '76 Olympics. Enjoy the game.